Why we are always elsewhere. The psychology of overthinking anxiety. There are nights when the city does not sleep, it only changes rhythm. We can hear it if we pay attention, the low hum of engines idling at red lights, the uneven footsteps on sidewalks, the distant echo of a siren dissolving into the humid air. Neon signs flicker, not quite steady, like they are unsure whether to stay or disappear. Somewhere above, in half-lit apartments, silhouettes move behind curtains. Somewhere below, a motorbike weaves through traffic as if time itself were chasing it. And in the middle of all this movement, we are here. Or at least, our bodies are. Because if we look closely, really closely, we begin to notice something unsettling. Our hands are holding a phone, but our mind is replaying something that happened 3 days ago. Our eyes are fixed on the road ahead, but internally we are arguing with a version of someone who is no longer present. Our chest rises and falls, but the breath is shallow, interrupted, as if it does not quite belong to us. We are here, but not fully. The strange thing is, this has become so normal that we rarely question it. We wake up already thinking. Before our feet touch the ground, the mind has traveled backwards into unfinished conversations, or forward into imagined responsibilities. We brush our teeth while rehearsing explanations. We eat while scrolling. We walk while anticipating. And so the present moment, the only place where life is actually unfolding, becomes something we pass through without ever arriving. It is like living in a city but never standing still long enough to feel its ground beneath our feet. If we pause for just a moment, we can begin to sense the cost of this way of living, not as an abstract idea, but as something physical, immediate, undeniable. There is a tightness in the jaw that we did not consciously choose, a slight pressure behind the eyes, as if we have been staring too long at something invisible. The shoulders, subtly lifted, holding a weight that has no clear shape. The breath, cut into small fragments, never quite completing itself. The body is always honest. It does not pretend to live in yesterday or tomorrow. It can only exist here, and yet it is constantly being pull-dragged, even by a mind that refuses to stay. We might notice it most clearly in quiet moments, standing in line, waiting for an elevator, sitting alone in a room where nothing urgent is happening. These are the moments when the mind reveals its habit. It does not rest. It searches, it reaches, it reconstructs and predicts. It fills the space with noise, not because something is wrong, but because stillness feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. And so we escape it. We reach for stimulation, for distraction, for anything that gives the mind another place to go. Not because we consciously decide to avoid the present, but because we have forgotten how to remain inside it. There is a subtle belief operating underneath all of this, a belief so deeply ingrained that we rarely see it clearly. We believe that the past still holds something we need to resolve before we can be at peace. We believe that the future contains something we must secure before we can relax, and so we live suspended between two places that do not exist. The past, which is already gone, the future, which has not yet arrived. Meanwhile, the present moment, the only place where breath is happening, where sound is being heard, where life is actually touching us, feels strangely insignificant, almost like a narrow hallway connecting more important rooms. We rush through it. But what if that hallway is the entire house? What if everything we are searching for, clarity, relief, connection, is not waiting somewhere ahead or hidden somewhere behind, but is only ever available here? This idea can feel almost too simple, almost disappointing at first, because the mind is used to complexity. It is used to solving, fixing, planning. It wants a destination, something to reach, something to become. But the present moment does not offer itself as a destination. It offers itself as reality, and reality, when we are not used to meeting it directly, can feel strangely empty or even confronting, because when we stop moving mentally, when we stop replaying, predicting, escaping, something else becomes visible. The raw texture of experience, the subtle unease we have been carrying, the unfinished emotions that surface when there is nothing left to distract us. This is why we keep moving, not just physically, but mentally. We move because stopping would mean feeling, and feeling, without the buffer of time, without the stories of past and future, can feel intense. But there is another way to understand this. Imagine the city again, not as something overwhelming, but as something alive. Every light turning on and off, every car stopping and starting, every sound appearing and disappearing. Nothing stays fixed, nothing holds its shape for long. And yet, the city is not chaotic in the way we imagine. It is flowing. There is a rhythm beneath the movement, a kind of intelligence that does not need to control every detail. Traffic lights change, people adjust. Movement happens, not because everything is planned perfectly, but because everything is responding in real time. Now consider this. Our mind is trying to live outside of this flow. It is trying to fix what has already passed. It is trying to secure what has not yet come. It is trying to step out of the living city and build a permanent structure in a place where nothing can remain unchanged. And this is where the tension begins. Because life does not happen in fixed structures. It happens in movement, in this breath, in this sound, in this moment that is already shifting, even as we try to hold it. If we become very still for a few seconds, we can start to notice something subtle but profound. The breath is already here, without effort. The sounds around us are arriving on their own. The body is alive, sensing, adjusting, responding. Life is not waiting, it is already happening. But the mind, conditioned to search elsewhere, keeps turning away from it. It is like standing in the middle of a vibrant city and closing our eyes, trying to remember a street that no longer exists, or imagining a building that has not yet been built. And in doing so, we miss everything that is actually here. This is the quiet tragedy of modern life. Not that we are too busy, but that we are rarely present for the life we are living. We accumulate experiences, but we do not inhabit them. We move through days, but we do not fully arrive in them. We breathe, but we do not feel the breath. And so, even when nothing is objectively wrong, there is a subtle sense of dissatisfaction, background tension, a feeling that something is always just slightly out of reach, because we are always just slightly elsewhere. But if we stay with this observation, not trying to fix it, not judging it, just seeing it clearly, something begins to shift. A question starts to emerge, not as a demand, but as a quiet invitation. If the past is no longer here and the future has not yet come, then where exactly is life happening? Not in theory, not in philosophy, but right now, in direct experience. Where is it? And perhaps more importantly, why do we keep leaving it? If we stay with that question, not rushing to answer it, not trying to turn it into an idol, begin to notice something uncomfortable, almost like a quiet exposure. Because the moment we try to locate where life is actually happening, we are pulled back into the body, not into theory but into sensation. The faint pulsing behind the temples, the slight contraction in the throat, the uneven rhythm of the breath, as if it has been interrupted too many times to remember its natural flow. And here, something becomes clear in a way that is difficult to ignore. The body is not confused. It is not lost between yesterday and tomorrow. It is here, carrying signals, tensions, imprints, all of them unfolding in real time. But the mind keeps overriding it. It keeps insisting on returning to places that no longer exist or projecting itself into spaces that have not yet formed. And this is where we begin to see the pattern more sharply, not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived experience. There are different ways this pattern expresses itself, but they all share the same root, a refusal, or perhaps an inability, to remain with what is here. We might recognize ourselves in one of these movements, or in all of them at different times. There is the one who keeps looking backward. We can picture this person clearly, because in some moments it is us, walking through the day, but internally replaying something that has already ended. A conversation that could have gone differently. A mistake that should not have happened. A version of ourselves that we wish we had been. And each time the memory arises, the body responds as if it is happening again. The chest tightens, the stomach contracts, the shoulders pull slightly forward as if bracing. The breath becomes slower, heavier, sometimes held for just a second too long. This is not just remembering. It is reliving the past, which no longer exists in reality, is being reconstructed in the present again and again through the body. And what makes this even more subtle is that it often feels justified. We tell ourselves we are processing, learning, understanding. But if we look closely, we see that much of this movement is not leading to clarity. It is looping, repeating, reinforcing a sense of self that is built entirely from what has already ended. I am the one who failed. I am the one who was hurt. I am the one who missed the chance. These statements feel solid, but they are constructed from fragments of memory. They are not alive in the way this breath is alive, and yet they shape how we experience the present moment. Then there is the one who keeps looking forward. This movement feels different in the body, but it carries its own kind of intention. The breath becomes shallow, quick, as if preparing for something that has not yet arrived. The eyes scan, not just the environment, but possibilities. The jaw tightens slightly, holding on to a sense of control. There is a subtle leaning forward in the posture, as if the body itself is trying to reach into the future. This is the planner, the predictor, the one who believes that peace will come once everything is arranged correctly, once the right decision is made, once the outcome is secured, once uncertainty is eliminated. But the future, by its very nature, cannot be stabilized. It has no form yet, and so the mind keeps working, trying to construct something solid out of something inherently unstable, running simulations, creating scenarios, preparing for outcomes that may never happen. And while this is happening, the present moment is again reduced to a means, something to get through, something to manage, something to optimize, not something to inhabit. And then there is another movement, quieter, but just as powerful, the one that does not want to look backward or forward, the one that simply wants to avoid. This is where we reach for distraction, not necessarily because we are curious, but because we are uncomfortable. We scroll without really seeing. We watch without really engaging. We fill the space with sound, with input, with anything that keeps us from having to sit inside the raw immediacy of our own experience. The body here tells a different story. It becomes dull. The posture collapses slightly. The breath becomes automatic, unnoticed. There is less tension perhaps, but also less aliveness, less clarity. It is not peace, it is absence. And what is striking is that all three of these movements, the one who looks back, the one who looks forward, and the one who avoids there, attempts to deal with something we rarely name directly, a subtle discomfort with being here. Not because the present moment is inherently unbearable, but because we have trained ourselves to experience it through layers of interpretation, through memory, through expectation, through distraction. So when those layers thin out, even slightly, we are left with something unfamiliar. Just this breath, this sensation, this moment, without commentary and without the usual narratives to hold on to. It can feel almost like standing in an open space with no walls, nothing to lean on, nothing to define us. And this is where the deeper tension begins to reveal itself. Because beneath the habit of time traveling, beneath the constant movement of the mind, there is a deeper attachment. Not just to the past or the future, but to the sense of I that is constructed through them. The past gives us identity. The future gives us direction. Without them, even briefly, there can be a sense of disorientation. If I am not my history, and I am not my projected future, then who or what am I right now? This question does not always arise as a clear thought. Sometimes it appears as unease, as restlessness, as the urge to reach for something, anything that restores a familiar sense of self. And so we return to the patterns, we replay, we predict, we distract, not because they bring peace, but because they maintain continuity. They keep the story of me intact, even if that story is painful, even if it is exhausting. There is a strange comfort in the familiar, even when the familiar is suffering. But if we stay with this long enough, not trying to escape, not trying to fix, we begin to notice something subtle but transformative. The discomfort we feel in the present moment is not coming from the moment itself. It is coming from the resistance to it, from the attempt to be somewhere else, from the habit of turning away. And in that recognition, something begins to open. Because if the discomfort is created by resistance, then perhaps the possibility of ease is not found by changing the moment, but by changing our relationship to it. This is not an idea to believe. It is something to observe directly, right now. If we allow the breath to come in fully without controlling it, without shaping it, just noticing the coolness as it enters, the slight expansion in the chest, and then allowing it to leave, slowly, naturally. There is a brief moment where nothing else is needed. No past, no future, no story. Just this simple, continuous movement. And in that moment, something very quiet but very real becomes available. Not excitement, not dramatic relief, but a kind of steadiness. A subtle sense that for this brief instant, nothing is missing. But almost immediately, the mind returns. It comments. It evaluates. It asks, is this working? And just like that, we are pulled out again back into movement, back into time. This is the pattern. And seeing it clearly is not a failure. It is the beginning of understanding. Because once we see that the mind is constantly creating distance from the present, we can begin to ask a different kind of question. Not how do I control my thoughts? Not how do I fix my past or guarantee my future? But something much simpler and much more direct. What is it that keeps adding a second layer of suffering to what is already here? What is it that takes a single moment and turns it into something heavier, more complicated, more painful than it needs to be? And as this question settles not as an intellectual puzzle, but as a lived inquiry, we begin to approach a deeper insight, one that does not just describe the problem, but begins to cut through it. And if we stay with that question gently, without forcing an answer, something begins to reveal itself in a way that is both simple and deeply unsettling. Because we start to notice that the moment itself is rarely the main source of our suffering. What hurts us is not just what happens. It is what the mind continues to do with what happens. A sound arrows is sharp, unexpected. The body flinches, that is immediate, that is natural. But then something else begins. Why did that happen? I don't like this. This shouldn't be happening. And suddenly, the original experience, simple, raw event has been surrounded by layers of resistance, interpretation, and judgment. This is where the weight comes from. Not from life as it unfolds, but from the way we meet it. There is an old teaching that describes this with striking clarity. It says that when we encounter pain, it is as if we are struck by an arrow. This first arrow is unavoidable. It is the reality of living. Loss, discomfort, disappointment. Physical pain, these are part of the human experience. No one escapes them. But then almost immediately we pick up a second arrow, and this one we aim at ourselves. This second arrow is made of thoughts, of stories, of resistance. Why me? This always happens to me. I'll never recover from this. I should have known better. And what is important to see clearly, directly, is that this second arrow is optional. Not easy to drop, but not inevitable. Yet most of us have practiced using it for so long that it feels automatic, almost like a reflex. The moment something uncomfortable arises, the mind moves in not to understand, but to amplify, not to soothe, but to tighten. And the body reflects this immediately. The jaw locks, the breath shortens, the chest constricts, as if protecting something fragile. The shoulders rise, holding tension that has nowhere to go. It is as if the body is preparing for a threat that is no longer present, or has not yet arrived. And in a very real sense, that is exactly what is happening. Because the second arrow does not live in reality. It lives in time, in the replaying of what has already happened, in the anticipation of what might happen next. And so we begin to see something that changes the entire perspective. We are not only experiencing life, we are continuously recreating it through the mind, moment by moment, layer by layer. And most of that creation is not neutral. It is filtered through habit, through identity, through a deeply ingrained sense of me. This is where the illusion becomes even more subtle, because the mind does not just replay events, it builds a self out of them. I am the one this happened to. I am the one who made that mistake. I am the one who must avoid this in the future. And over time, these statements begin to feel solid, fixed, as if they describe something permanent. But if we look carefully, we see that this self is constantly being assembled from fragments, from memories that arise and pass, from thoughts that appear and disappear, from sensations that shift moment to moment. There is no single stable entity underneath it all, only a continuous process of construction, like a city at night, where lights turn on and off, traffic flows, people come and go. From a distance it looks solid, but up close it is movement. Constant, ungraspable movement, and yet we keep trying to hold it still. We try to define ourselves based on what has already changed. We try to secure ourselves in a future that does not yet exist, and in doing so, we create tension, because we are asking something fluid to behave as if it were fixed. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of our suffering. We want certainty in a reality that is inherently changing. We want permanence in something that is built from movement. We want control over something that is not designed to be controlled in that way. And when reality does not conform to these expectations, we experience friction. Not just once, but repeatedly, because the expectation itself remains unexamined. But what happens if we begin to see this clearly not as an idea, but as something we can observe directly? What happens if instead of immediately reacting to discomfort, we pause just long enough to notice what is actually here? Not the story about it, not the memory it reminds us of, not the future it threatens, but the raw experience itself. A tightness in the chest, a warmth in the face, a pressure behind the eyes, a movement of breath, just this. And then, alongside it, we notice something else, the impulse to add, to interpret, to resist, to turn the sensation into a narrative. And in that moment of seeing, just seeing, there is a small but significant shift. Because we are no longer completely inside the experience, we are aware of it. And this awareness has a different quality. It does not push away. It does not cling. It does not build a second arrow. It simply knows this is happening. And as simple as that sounds, it changes the entire structure of experience. Because without the second arrow, the first arrow is just a sensation. It moves, it changes, it eventually passes. But with the second arrow, it becomes something else. A story that loops, a weight that lingers, a pattern that repeats. And this is why we often feel that our suffering is continuous. Not because the original pain never ends, but because the mind keeps renewing it, revisiting it, reinforcing it, giving it a kind of life that it would not have on its own. If we pause here, even briefly, and let this sink in not as something to agree with, but as something to observe in our own experience, there can be a moment of quiet recognition. Silent 60 seconds, ambient sound, distant rain soft against glass. In that space, something becomes possible. Not a dramatic transformation, not an instant release, but a subtle shift in direction. Instead of moving further into the pattern, we begin to step slightly outside of it. And from there, a new question emerges. If the second arrow is something we are adding, if the sense of self we defend is something being constructed moment by moment, if the past is no longer here and the future has not yet arrived, then what would it mean to stop building? Even for a moment, to stop reinforcing, to stop reaching into time for identity, for control, for certainty, and instead, to return not to an idea, not to a belief, but to the only place where life is actually unfolding. Here, this breath, this sensation, moment that does not need to be completed, improved, or escaped. And if we begin to explore this not perfectly, not continuously, but sincerely, we start to discover that presence is not something we create. It is something we uncover. It is what remains when we stop leaving. But how do we do that in a world that constantly pulls us away? How do we remain here when the mind has spent years, even decades, practicing how to go elsewhere? This is where understanding must become practice, where insight must become something lived, not occasionally, but repeatedly, gently, and with a kind of discipline that does not come from force, but from clarity. And this is where everything becomes more honest, because it is one thing to understand that the present moment is the only place life exists. It is another thing entirely to remain there, not for a few seconds, not as a concept, but as a way of living. We quickly discover that the mind does not easily give up its habits. It does not quietly agree to stay. It pulls constantly, back into memory, forward into anticipation, sideways into distraction. And if we approach this as a battle, trying to force the mind into silence, trying to control every thought, we create yet another layer of tension, another form of the second arrow. So the question is not how to dominate the mind, but how to relate to it differently. And this is where a new image can guide us. Imagine that within the city, amid all the movement, the lights, the noise, there is a central control room. Not a place that controls every detail, but a place that sees everything, every street, every signal, every shift in movement. This control room does not chase the traffic. It does not run after every car. It remains where it is, and from that still point it understands. This is what awareness is like. It is not another thought. It is not another reaction. It is the capacity to notice, to observe without immediately interfering. And the moment we begin to rest in this awareness, 7 briefly are no longer lost in the city. We are within it, but not entangled in every movement. This is the beginning of practice. Not escaping life, but changing how we meet it. And it starts in a place so simple that the mind often overlooks it, the body. Because while the mind travels through time, the body does not. It breathes now. It feels now. It exists only here. So we begin here, not with something abstract, but with something direct, the breath, not controlling it, not shaping it, just noticing the air entering cool, subtle, almost easy, to miss the slight expansion in the chest, the ribs moving outward, the pause brief and natural, and then the exhale longer, softer, releasing. At first, this seems almost too simple. The mind quickly says, this is nothing. But if we stay just a little longer, we begin to see that this nothing has a quiet depth. Because while we are with the breath, something else is not happening. We are not replaying. We are not predicting. We are not constructing for that moment. We are here, and then inevitably the mind moves again. A thought appears, a memory pulls, a plan forms, and this is where the practice deepens. Because the moment we notice that we have left, that awareness itself is the return. Not forcing the thought away, not criticizing ourselves for drifting, just recognizing, the mind has moved, and gently, almost like placing something fragile back onto a table, we return to the breath, to the body, to this moment, this movement away and back, away and back. This is not failure, this is the training. Each return strengthens something subtle, not concentration in the usual sense, but familiarity with presence. We begin to learn what it feels like to be here. Not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And gradually, something shifts. The gap between leaving and returning becomes shorter. The awareness becomes more continuous. The present moment becomes less like a place we visit, and more like a place we inhabit. But the breath is only the beginning. Because life does not happen only when we are sitting still. It happens in movement, in conversation, in action. So the practice must expand. We begin to bring this same awareness into simple activities. Drinking water, feeling the glass in the hand, the temperature, the movement of swallowing, walking, not just to arrive somewhere, but to feel each step, the contact of the foot with the ground, the shifting of weight, the subtle balance of the body, listening, not preparing a response, not evaluating, but actually hearing the tone, the pauses, the presence of another human being. These moments are not extraordinary. They are ordinary, but when we are fully in them, they become complete. Nothing is missing, and this is where we begin to understand something important. The present moment is not narrow. It only feels narrow when we are not inside it. When we are here, even the simplest experience has texture, depth, aliveness. But there is another layer of practice on that becomes essential when difficulty arises. Because it is easy to be present when things are calm. It is much harder when there is discomfort, when there is pain, when something does not go the way we want. This is where the second arrow usually appears most strongly, and this is where the practice becomes transformative. When a difficult emotion arises, fear, anger, sadness, the first instinct is to move away, to fix it, to explain it, to get rid of it. But what if instead we did something different? What if we turned toward it? Not the story, not the narrative, but the raw sensation in the body. Where is it? Is it in the chest, the throat, the stomach? What does it feel like? Tight, heavy, burning, moving? And can we stay with it, just the sensation, without immediately adding meaning? This is not passive. It requires attention. It requires steadiness, but something remarkable begins to happen when we do this. The sensation, when not resisted, begins to change. Not because we force it to, but because all sensations are inherently unstable. They arise, they shift, they pass. But when we add the second arrow, when we resist, analyze, judge, lock them in place, we give them continuity. So this practice of staying with direct experience begins to loosen that continuity. It allows experience to move as it naturally does. And in doing so, it reveals something that the mind rarely believes at first. We can feel discomfort without being overwhelmed by it. We can experience pain without becoming it. We can remain present, even in difficulty. And as this becomes more familiar, another shift begins to occur. We start to see that what we have been calling self is not as solid as it once seemed. Instead of I am anxious, there is anxiety is present. Instead of I am angry, there is anger is arising. This may seem like a small change in language, but it reflects a profound shift in perception. Because now, experience is something that happens, not something that defines us. And in that space, there is more freedom, more flexibility, less need to defend, to control, to hold on to a fixed identity. We begin to live more like the city itself, responsive, fluid, alive. without needing to freeze any moment into permanence. And slowly, almost quietly, the relationship to time begins to change. The past loses its grip not because it is erased, but because it is no longer constantly reactivated. The future loses its urgency not because we stop planning, but because we are no longer trying to live there. And the present moment becomes enough, not perfect, not always comfortable, but complete. And from this completeness, something unexpected emerges, a kind of ease, not the ease of everything going our way, but the ease of not needing things to be different in order to be at peace. And from here, life continues. The city still moves, the lights still flicker, the sounds still rise and fall, but we are no longer chasing them. We are no longer lost. We are here. And in being here, we begin to discover something that was never actually missing. A quiet stability, a clarity that does not depend on circumstances, a sense that, even in the middle of movement, there is a place that does not move, and it has been available all along, right here in this moment. So now, the question is no longer how to escape time, but how deeply we are willing to enter this moment that has always been waiting. And once we begin to live this way, something very quiet but very powerful starts to change. The city is still the city. The traffic still moves. The lights still flicker. People still speak. Hurry, wait, forget, remember, fear, hope, and reach. But we no longer experience all of it as a demand to become someone else. We no longer see every sound as an interruption. We no longer treat every discomfort as a signal that something is wrong with life. Instead, life becomes more like weather. Sometimes bright, sometimes heavy, sometimes still, sometimes sudden, but always passing through. And we, standing here with a little more steadiness, begin to understand that we do not need to become the weather in order to live within it. We do not need to identify with every cloud. We do not need to collapse under every storm. We can feel without drowning. We can think without being carried away. We can remember without being trapped. We can anticipate without abandoning the present. This is not a small change. It is the difference between being ruled by life and being intimate with it. Because when presence deepens, the world does not become less real. It becomes more real. The sound of a spoon touching a cup becomes crisp, alive, immediate. The warmth of sunlight on the arm becomes almost startling in its simplicity. A friend's face, once blurred by our mental noise, appears with new texture, new tenderness. Even silence changes. It is no longer empty. It becomes spacious. It becomes full. And in that fullness, the nervous system begins to settle in a way it has long forgotten. The shoulders lower without permission. The jaw unclenches. The breath reaches deeper into the body. The belly softens. The eyes no longer need to scan so desperately for what is next. This is what happens when we stop living in fragments. The body remembers that it does not have to prepare for every ghost of the past or every shadow of the future. It can rest inside what is actually happening. And when the body rests, the mind also changes. Not immediately, not perfectly, but enough to notice. Thoughts still arise, of course, but they do not carry the same authority. A memory comes and goes. A plan appears and is seen as a plan. A fear moves through and is recognized as fear. We are no longer fusing with each event. We are witnessing it, and that witnessing creates space. Space between stimulus and response. Space between feeling and story. Space between what happens and what we make it mean. That space is where freedom begins. Not the freedom of controlling outcomes, but the freedom of not being entirely owned by them. This is the deeper calm the teaching points toward. Not numbness, not escape, not spiritual performance, but a clear, grounded presence that does not require the world to freeze in order to feel safe. A presence that can meet movement without panic. A presence that can meet uncertainty without collapse. A presence that does not need the past to remain alive in order to know who it is. And this is why the simple sentence at the heart of this whole journey matters so much. The past has already dissolved. The future has not yet been born. What remains always is this living instant, not as an idea to admire, not as a theory to repeat, but as the very place where consciousness touches life, the very place where breath enters and leaves, the very place where choice becomes possible, the very place where suffering can be seen clearly enough to loosen its grip. When we live here, we do not become detached in the cold sense. We become more available, more responsive, more human. We can listen without rehearsing our reply. We can help without needing recognition. We can work without turning every task into an identity. We can love without trying to possess. We can grieve without being destroyed. We can feel the full weight of being alive without demanding that life become less alive in order to suit us. And perhaps this is the deepest peace available to us. Not a peace that removes all difficulty, but a peace that no longer depends on difficulty disappearing. A peace that can remain present inside change, inside uncertainty, inside impermanence, inside the great moving, ungraspable flow of existence. The city still glows. The rain still falls somewhere beyond the window. A motorbike still passes in the distance. Someone still laughs. Someone else still sits alone with a heavy heart. And all of it is happening now. This is the only ground we ever truly stand on. Not the memory of a ground, not the hope of a future ground, but the living contact of this exact moment. If we can remain here, even imperfectly, even briefly, even after having been carried away 100 times, then something in us begins to mature. Something becomes less frantic, less divided, less hungry for escape. And in that maturity, there is a kind of beauty that cannot be manufactured. A quiet confidence, a clarity that does not shout, a freedom that does not need to prove itself. We do not become invulnerable. We become present, and presence, more than any perfect answer, is what allows a life to be lived fully. So let the past rest where it belongs. Let the future unfold when it comes. And let this breath, this one, right now be enough to remind us that life has never been elsewhere. It has always been here. We begin to sense, slowly, that peace is not found by escaping life, but by no longer arguing with its nature. And this changes everything. Because when we stop demanding that the moment be different before we can relax, we discover a strange generosity in reality itself. The breath continues, the heart continues. Sound comes and goes, thoughts rise and fall. Feelings gather and disperse like weather moving across a wide sky. Nothing needs our permission to be alive, and nothing stays long enough to be owned. At first, this can feel almost too subtle to trust. The mind may ask, is this it? Is this all? But that questions itself is part of the old hunger, the hunger to turn presence into an achievement, to make awakening into another destination. The deeper truth is gentler than that. It does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives as a reduction in inner struggle. Less gripping, less resistance, less need to become someone else in order to feel at home. And in that lessening, the whole inner landscape changes. A difficult conversation no longer has to echo forever in the nervous system. A mistake no longer has to define the entire self. An uncertain future no longer has to be rehearsed into a catastrophe. The mind still creates movement, but it no longer dominates the room. It becomes like a bird crossing the sky, visible, real, but not permanent. We watch it pass, and we do not have to follow it into the distance. This is a profound kind of freedom, because it does not depend on conditions being perfect. It depends on seeing clearly. It depends on knowing that whatever appears fear, joy, regret, hope, longing is arising in a living field that is larger than any single thought or feeling. And when that recognition matures, something inside us becomes less brittle. We are no longer built entirely out of yesterday's pain. We are no longer reaching frantically toward tomorrow's promise. We are standing in a living present that can hold both sorrow and gratitude without breaking. This is why impermanence is not a threat once it is understood. It is the reason relief is possible. If every feeling lasted forever, we would be trapped. If every moment hardened into identity, we would have no room to breathe. But because life is changing all the time, there is always an opening, always a doorway, always a chance to begin again. That is the hidden mercy of this moment. It does not ask us to be finished. It asks us to be awake. And awakening is not a final state handed down from above. It is a repeated return to what is already here. Again and again we come back. Again and again we notice the mind wandering. Again and again we return to the body, to the breath, to the immediacy of sensation, to the simple fact of being alive. This repetition is not failure. It is the path itself. At some point, the listener begins to feel the quiet dignity of this. There is nothing glamorous about presence. No performance, no mask, no announcement, just an intimate, steady willingness to meet life as it is. That willingness softens the inner war. It does not erase pain, but it removes the extra cruelty we so often add to pain. It does not prevent change, but it makes change easier to carry. And there, In that steadiness, a different self emerges, not a fixed identity, not a spiritual persona, but a more honest way of being. Less defended, less fragmented, more spacious, more available to love, to work, to rest, to grieve, to create. A self that does not need the past to keep proving its wounds, and does not need the future to keep proving its worth. This is the peace beneath the noise. Not a perfect life, a present one. Not a life without storms, a life no longer terrified of the rain. And if we listen closely now, after all the movement, after all the inner traveling, there is something almost tender in the silence that remains. It tells us that we have never been as far away as we imagined. The life we were searching for was not hidden in a future we could earn, nor buried in a past we could repair. It was waiting in the only place it could ever exist, the living moment we are touching right now. So we soften, we breathe, we stand inside this breath without demanding more from it. And in that small, complete act, we taste what it means to come home. What would change in your life if you truly stopped visiting the past and stopped moving into the future and stayed here long enough to discover what is already whole?